Okay, so in our last video, we introduced this idea of the neutralization, or the equivalence point, where we take equal moles of an acid with equal moles of a base, and we use them to cancel each other out. So now, in order to find out the number of moles of acid and the moles of the base, we're going to need to use our equation for finding moles, which involves molarity. So you might remember this equation, m times v equals n. Or in words, that the moles is equal to the molarity, which is the concentration, times the volume of the solution you have. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this little equation here, molarity times volume, and I'm going to substitute it for the acid, moles of acid, and the moles of the base. So the moles of the acid is going to be the molarity of the acid times the volume of the acid. And then for my other substitution, the moles of the base is going to be equal to the molarity of the base times the volume of the base, which I've color-coded. So the molarity of the acid times the volume of the acid is red. The molarity of the base times the volume of the base is blue. And these two sides, when they are equal, I have reached the equivalence point. Or vice versa, when I've reached the equivalence point, then I know these two are equal. And that's the way we're going to use this property to help us solve our problem. So we're going to do what is called a titration. A titration is a chemical process, a lab technique, you might say, when we use the equivalence point to find out how much of a known solution is needed to neutralize a mystery solution. So one thing is known and one thing is a mystery. Starting to sound a little bit like algebra. So in our case, we're going to use a known base to figure out just how acidic our sample is. And by our sample, what I mean is this water flowing out of our mine that's polluted with acid. We want to figure out how acidic it is so we know how much base to add to it. And I don't need to take the entire, I don't need to do a measurement of the entire acid mine. Instead, I can just take a small sample of a known volume and then use my equation to solve for, and my experiment to solve for the concentration. And I'm going to show you how that works. So we have here our equation. Again, we have the molarity of the acid times the volume of the acid, and those are both in red. And then we have the molarity of our base times the volume of our base. Now, in our situation, again, imagine I've taken a small sample. Here I have a small sample of acid of a known volume, but I wonder what the concentration of the acid is. So what I'm going to utilize is a setup that has a known concentration of base, and I'm going to figure out what volume of it I need to neutralize. So the volume of the acid is going to be known because I'm going to pick that sample ahead of time and I'm not going to add any more acid to the situation. And then the molarity of the base is going to be known. So those are both known. Then the volume of the base we're going to measure. And we're going to measure very carefully using this material, this piece of glassware called a burette. And then at the end of the day, that's going to help us to find molarity of the acid, which is our goal. We're trying to find what concentration the acid is so that we can then treat it properly. So I'm going to rearrange this equation by dividing both sides by the volume. When I do that, the volume is going to disappear from this side and appear over here. And so I have the molarity of the base times the volume of the base, which I'm going to measure, divided by the volume of the acid I start with. And then that will give me the molarity of the acid. So that's going to be our strategy. In our next video, I'm going to show you the setup and go through the titration, and then I may or may not have a follow-up video where I go through the notes for it. So, catch you next time.